Hello everyone, and good afternoon and welcome to what is actually the very first webinar by the Institute of Marriage and Family Canada. We are very pleased to have you join us, and we have people tuning in from clear across the country, so this is very exciting. We'll just maybe have a little bit of introduction and allow the last few stragglers to log in case anyone's having any technical problems. My name is Eloise Catadella. I'm the Director of Communications at the Institute of Marriage and Family Canada. And some of you tuning in today are friends of the Institute, whereas others perhaps don't know very much about us, so allow me to give you a little bit of background information. The Institute of Marriage and Family Canada is a think tank. We are a social policy think tank based in Ottawa, and we look at all sorts of issues that affect the Canadian family: marriage, childcare, family finance, education policies such as bullying and sex ed curriculums, demographics, the fact that Canada is aging and we're having fewer children being born, and how that affects the country, and so on. We inform politicians and media and community leaders like yourselves about what strengthens and also what harms families, all based on what the social science research shows. And we do this from the perspective of public policy, so always asking, what can leaders do? What can politicians do to help families? If you haven't seen our website, we invite you to check that out. You can find that at www.imfcanada.org. And what you'll find there is our latest work and research and also media interviews. And you'll want to get yourself onto our mailing list if you're not already. You'll see in the middle of the page that there is an orange tab that says subscribe to our e-newsletter. If you click on that and enter your name and email address, presto, you'll be on our mailing list. And we're conservative in the number of emails we send out. We try not to bombard people with information, so it's usually 2 or 3 emails per month. But those emails would keep you in touch with us and also on top of the latest in family research, as well as any policy debates that are happening in the country. Some of you actually may be more familiar with our parent organization. The Institute of Marriage and Family Canada is actually the research arm of Focus on the Family Canada out in beautiful BC. And Focus on the Family Canada is much more hands-on in the way that they help and support families. You may have come across their fantastic radio shows. They also have excellent magazines and resources for families. One thing that I'd like to tell you about today, since so many of you tuning in happen to be pastors, is that Focus on the Family has retreats for pastors and for their spouses. It's called Kerith Retreats, and you can find out more about that at their website, kerithretreats.ca. Kerith is spelled K-E-R-I-T-H, so kerithretreats.ca. But pastors and priests and social workers, you're all on the front lines of helping families. So when families are struggling, they come to you. They often come to you first, and you help and you serve in whatever way you can. And this is so valuable to those families and to society as a whole, but it can also be draining. And so if you feel like you might be a little bit drained and in need of a recharge, have your batteries recharged, then you'll definitely want to check out Kerith Retreats. They have a retreat center in Alberta, as well as a brand new one that's just opened up in Manitoba. And I'm hoping that they open their retreats up to policy wonks like myself because they just look so beautiful. But to the topic at hand, our topic today is the changing Canadian family. We've seen that marriage in Canada and really across the Western world has been in decline for decades now. And this has affected families and children in particular in many ways. So we're going to take a closer look at these trends and at what our national statistics have been showing. And we just hope that this will help community leaders such as yourselves to think creatively about ways to tackle the challenges that families are often facing today. Our speaker for this talk is Peter John Mitchell. Peter John is the senior researcher here at the Institute of Marriage and Family Canada. Peter John studies how family formation affects the welfare of Canadians, in particular how family breakdown affects children and their ability to flourish. His seminal study earlier this year on the marriage gap between rich and poor Canadians revealed that there is actually a strong link between marriage and wealth in Canada, and he'll be telling you more about that today. Peter John has studied public policy issues at the Focus Leadership Institute in Colorado. He also has a degree in history and political science from the University of Western Ontario, as well as a Master of Theology from Tyndale Seminary. So we're very pleased to have him today to give us this snapshot of the research on family trends. His talk is going to run for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we should have some time at the end for some Q&A. So feel free to ask questions. You'll see at the sidebar on the right that GoToWebinar has a question box. So just look in that sidebar on the right, and when you find the question box, you can feel free to type questions in there at any point when they come, as they come to you, and we'll try to get as many of those answered as possible at the end. And now I'm very pleased to welcome Peter John Mitchell, our speaker, and we can pass it over to him. Peter John, are you with us?
I am. Great. Thanks very much, Eloise, and thanks for joining us today. So over the next few minutes, we're going to explore the changes that have been happening in the Canadian family over the last 35 to 40 years. And specifically, this is the outline of where we're headed. We're going to explore the story of what's happening to marriage and why it matters. That's where we're going to spend the majority of our time together this afternoon. And then we're going to delve into a subplot of that story, of that narrative, through the Canadian marriage divide, Canadian marriage gap, which is a project that we did earlier this year that Eloise mentioned. And I think that's an important part of the story that as community leaders you're going to want to know about and think through. The last little bit of the webinar at the very end, we're going to look at the implications for faith leaders and community leaders. As many of you are faith leaders and community leaders, I think you're well positioned to think through those implications once you have the information. I'm trusting that. But I'm going to give you a couple of thoughts that I have, and then we're going to close with two programs that are currently creating healthy marriage cultures as a way to maybe inspire some good thinking on this. I think one of the big stories within the change that's happened in the Canadian marriage and within the Canadian family is just the rapid change. And society is changing, and there's change all around us. If you think about the technological devices that you've owned over the last 10 years, you'll see that there's so much has changed, and even just in technology. I took my family to the Museum of Technology and was a little taken aback to see that the home phone that I grew up with was behind glass in the History of Telecommunications exhibit. That's pretty sobering. You see your childhood memories in a museum, but it just reminded me that just as technology is rapidly changing, so is our culture. And what we've noticed in particular is that there has been a significant shift in how we both understand and how we practice marriage. So I'd like to illustrate what's been happening to marriage over the last 35 plus years through the following story. So I'm going to invite you to travel back in time to 1976 to meet Mike and Sarah. Now, Mike and Sarah are deeply in love. They stare longingly into each other's eyes over dinner as Barry Manilow, of course, croons on the radio in the background of the restaurant where they're sharing a meal. Later that evening, they'll cuddle in the darkness of a theater to take in Rocky. Mike's pick, of course, because it's his 25th birthday, and probably the last time that he'll get to choose the movie in this relationship. Now, he and Sarah, who is his junior by 2 years, at age 23, are getting married later this summer, as you can see from the photo. Now, Mike and Sarah are just starting out life together. Michael has started his first real job with a company where he'll spend most of his career, and Sarah has completed her training as a nurse. And despite feeling that they barely have 2 quarters to rub together, they are looking forward to a lifetime together as a married couple. The wedding is simple and beautiful, as you can see from Mike's lovely shirt there, in which he's wishing he had that back. Within 2 years, Sarah's expecting their first. Mike and Sarah are in good company, as many of their friends are getting married, and others starting families, or at least thinking of starting families. In fact, the year that Mike and Sarah get married, they join 90% of all families that are headed by a married couple. Following the birth of Julie, they welcomed their son Robert in 1980, and another daughter, Michelle, 2 years after that. The early 80s proved to be a challenging time. Interest rates shoot through the roof, and Mike falls into bed exhausted each night, wondering how he's going to keep up with the mortgage. And it's not just the finances in those early years. It's the pace of family life is picking up, especially when Sarah heads back into the workforce part-time. Now, like all married couples, Mike and Sarah have their rough patches. But those disagreements, followed by the brooding silences, are more foreboding when Sarah learns that her best friend is filing for divorce. And like a bad cold, it seems that the divorce is spreading through their peer group and their friends. It's now 1987, and the Canadian divorce rate is peaking at 50%, following changes in the divorce law that make it both easier and faster to end a marriage. Sarah and Mike survive the bumps and bruises. They parent their kids through the adventures of puberty and vow that by the time Michelle hits the teen years, they'll finally get this parenting thing right. Third time's the charm. Now, Mike and Sarah survive the teen years, and they can hardly believe it when their baby Michelle is heading off to university in the fall. Well, fast forward to 2011. Sarah is now 58, and Mike has just celebrated the big 6-0. It's been 35 years since they snuggled that night in a theater watching Rocky prevail in the ring. Interestingly, 35 years later, Sylvester Stallone's big screen role is as the voice of Joe the Lion in Kevin James' Zookeeper. Oh, how the mighty fall. Well, in addition to celebrating their 35th this summer, Mike and Sarah are getting ready for their son Robert's wedding. At age 31, Robert has spent his 20s completing his education, including an MBA. He's squeezed in some travel while building his career. He's worked for a couple of companies, but he's now settling for now with one of the big 5 banks. And that's where he's met his bride-to-be, Rachel, a 29-year-old MBA quickly climbing the corporate ladder. Now, prior to meeting one another, Rob and Rachel both had serious relationships in which they lived with their respective partners. And Rob and Rachel decided to move in together about 2 years ago, but things in their relationship moved up to the next level when they bought a condo together about a year ago. For a long time, Rachel wasn't sure if or when marriage would fit into her life. Her parents divorced and when she was in late elementary school, and she's always been a little skeptical about the possibility of forever. She loves her parents, both of whom remarried, but she felt like she was caught between 2 worlds, 2 families. And she understands the stress that comes with juggling commitments and loyalties to all the parties involved. Anyway, she spent her 20s thinking that if marriage were in the cards, it was definitely for later. And Rachel's not alone in viewing marriage as one of many competing options. The day that she and Rob marry, they join about 67% of families that are headed by a married couple. That's compared to 90% of families that were headed by a married couple the day that Sarah and Mike got married. Now, some of Rob and Rachel's friends are also getting married, but some are happy just to live together for now. Now, Sarah doesn't want to put too fine a point on it, but she's wondering just how soon Rob and Rachel will be having her grandkids. They've been living together for a couple of years now, and by the time that Sarah was Rachel's age, she already had 3 kids in tow. So perhaps it's time to at least start thinking about it. It's a little more complex in Rachel's eyes. Her career is taking off, and there's this promotion in sight. She knows that fertility waits for no woman, and she wants to plan any pregnancies that she has around her career goals. Rob, for his part, is also thinking about having kids someday, but first he'd like to ensure that they are both financially secure and perhaps upgrade to a larger home. Now, there's no one path into family formation, but the story of Mike and Sarah and Rob and Rachel do illustrate the statistical trends that we've seen in family formation in general, and in particular the pathways into marriage over the last 35 plus years. There's been a major shift in the marriage narrative. And for Mike and Sarah, marriage really signaled the beginning of building a life together. They married, started jobs, built assets, bought a house, had kids, and so on. Sociologist Andrew Sherlin calls this the foundational view of marriage. But increasingly, this model of marriage is being replaced by the type of marriage that Rob and Rachel are modeling, which Sherlin calls the Capstone view. Rob and Rachel build a life for themselves before getting married. Many young adults and many millennials are getting their education, developing careers, seeking financial security, and perhaps even purchasing property if they can afford it. But all this before they're getting married. And increasingly, we're seeing couples having kids before they get married as well. For Rob and Rachel, marriage is a destination rather than the starting point. It's a symbol of achievement of certain life goals. It's really a capstone, as Sherlyn says. This significant shift in marriage is also occurring at a time when marriage is declining as a family form. And as marriage has declined, other family structures are becoming more common. So you think back to the 1960s, lone parent families accounted for about 9% of all census families. Well, today lone parent families account for about 16% of all lone parent family or all census families. But what's really striking is the change in composition of lone parent families. So look at this chart I have here. This shows the composition change of lone parent families between Mike and Sarah's wedding in 1976 and Rob and Rachel's wedding in 2011. As you can see, that bottom bar, a kind of orangey brown, burnt orange I'll call it, is widowed lone parent families. The red there is the divorced and separated. And what you can see at the top there is that growth in never married lone parent families. In 1976, it was just 7% of lone parent families were headed by a never married parent. But by 2011, that's up to nearly 32%. So we've seen a significant shift in the nature of lone parent families within one generation. Now, perhaps the most significant change that's impacted marriage has been the rapid growth of common law relationships. Now, Statistics Canada began tracking and measuring common law relationships in 1981. And you can see here that at that time was just slightly less than 6% of all census families. But by 2011, the portion of common law families has surpassed lone parent families to nearly 17% of all census families. Like Rob and Rachel, some of these common law unions function as a pre-marriage or a test marriage. And often this is a deliberate progression within the relationship. But some couples drift into common law relationships. So perhaps they spend a night or two together, then the toothbrush moves over, and finally the rest of the stuff. And it's interesting that not infrequently common law couples struggle to answer researchers' questions about how long they've lived together because they've drifted into these arrangements. Now, in other cases, common law relationships are becoming more common in terms of replacing marriage. Either couples are preferring to leave the back door open, so to speak, or they feel that they don't really need the paperwork, that it's sort of an unnecessary part of living together. Well, common law relationships are more likely among young adults, and certainly the data bears that out. We've seen a tremendous growth fairly quickly, among this type of union among boomers in particular, as boomers divorce and then repartner but don't necessarily remarry. Now, there was a study that came out this summer that suggests that common law relationships, as they become more prevalent, fewer of these relationships are actually moving into marriage. So this figure that you see here is looking at the breakdown of census families from the time, again, from Mike and Sarah's wedding in 76 to Rob and Rachel's wedding in 2011. And you can see married couples has been declining. You can see, of course, growth in the common law couples in the red there, and the growth in lone parent families in the gray. Not captured in this graph is the portion of unattached individuals, which has doubled since the 1960s. Now, this has occurred for a number of reasons. People are getting into marriage later, as I was illustrated in the story. For Mike and Sarah, Mike got married when he was 25, Sarah 23. That was the average age of first marriage in 76. In 2011, it's 31 for men and 29 for women. Also, there's the prominence of divorce has led, obviously, to more unattached individuals, as well as an aging population, more marriages, and particularly in the future, as the population of Canada ages, more marriages will end because of the death of a spouse. Now, this has created a really interesting cultural conversation. We're seeing books that are like this one, Going Solo, that talk about the benefits of living alone, particularly in metropolitan areas. Or this National Post headline that I saw this summer, Pets as Partners, Growing Numbers of Young Singles Treat Cats and Dogs Like Replacement Girlfriends and Boyfriends. Well, why should we care about this decline of marriage? And you can see the chart there looking at 1971 through to 2011. This is census data. Why does the decline of marriage matter? Why does childbearing outside of marriage matter? Why should we be concerned about that? Well, before we explore that, I just want to offer up an important caveat. How Canadians organize their families is a very sensitive topic. We know that life events beyond personal control do contribute to marital status, and we certainly know that not every marriage is a healthy marriage or a safe marriage. Children from non-married families can and do grow up to be successful in career and in life, win Nobel Prizes and become President of the United States. So today I want to acknowledge the sensitivity around this topic and around family formation. At the same time, we are looking at broad trends and broad social context of family change in Canada. So why should we care about the decline of marriage in Canada? Well, I don't know if you remember this, but back in 1992 during the presidential debates in the U.S., Vice President Dan Quayle, in a campaign speech in California, criticized a fictional TV character. I don't know if you remember who it is, but if you guessed Murphy Brown, you're right. He criticized the fictional character Murphy Brown, who was a professional woman who was single, who chose to have a baby on her own, that is, without a man in the picture, without a father. So Dan Quayle, in his speech, criticized this as a poor example for Americans, and he criticized the idea that of choosing deliberately to have a child without a father involved in the picture. It created quite an uproar. In fact, the producers of the Murphy Brown show actually created a segment where the characters in the show responded to Dan Quayle's comments. Interestingly enough, about 2 years ago, respected family scholar and economist Isabel Sawhill, who works for the Brookings Institution, which is a think tank in the U.S. that tries to navigate between the political left and political right. They try to kind of offer, I think, at least an attempt to offer a balanced perspective. Well, she wrote an article for the Washington Post under the title, "20 Years Later, It Turns Out Dan Quayle Was Right About Murphy Brown." And she wrote this in the wake of an explosion in non-marital births in the U.S. And in it she writes, quote, "Quayle's words seem less controversial than prophetic." And one of the reasons that she wrote that is since that those comments and that uproar, we have about 20 years of social science data looking at outcomes of children from various family structures and various family forms. Now, in that article, she provided 3 themes of why she thinks marriage still matters, or why we should be concerned about non-marital childbearing. And I'm going to borrow those themes, although I've reworded them and I've brought in some Canadian data and our own data on that. But I think it's really interesting and informative the way that she's framed that. So I will play off her themes there. So why does the decline of marriage matter in Canada? First, marriage is good for adults and for children. As I said, we have about 20 years of social science data that reveals the benefits for adults, including economic benefits, emotional benefits, even health benefits. You'll see every once in a while an article in the paper about the health benefits of being married. Among the many benefits for children, being raised in an intact married parent home increases the likelihood of attaining good grades, including the possibility of graduating from high school, pursuing post-secondary education. And children from intact married homes tend to be less likely to get in trouble with the law and less likely to be involved in a teen pregnancy. So there are benefits for both children and for adults. Second, on the whole, marital commitments seem to be more stable than cohabitating relationships. Even a recent release from Statistics Canada that looked at living arrangements for children acknowledges that still, even as common law relationships are increasing in Canada, marital relationships seem to be more stable in the long run. Now, what you see here is a chart from a study done in Australia from a number of years ago that looked at not only this question, but looked at marriages that begin as a cohabiting relationship versus marriage relationships that do not. So the red bar there represents those marriages that started without a cohabiting relationship to begin with, and then the blue is those marriage relationships that did start as a cohabiting relationship. So 10 years after marriage, 84% of the relationships that did not begin with a cohabiting relationship remained intact, compared to 75% 20 years, that bar below it, 20 years after marriage, 68% of marriages that did not begin as cohabiting relationships remained intact compared to 55%. Now, other data and other studies suggest that cohabiting relationships report lower levels of relational interaction and happiness. And data from a study that we were involved in a few years ago showed that after controlling for various factors, children from cohabitating homes were more likely to be involved in several risk behaviors compared to the national average. Now again, family structure is not destiny, but all the same, some of this data is concerning. Academics from the Brookings Institution and from Princeton University have summed up the body of research on family structure and child outcomes this way, and I'll read it for you. Although it was once possible to believe that high rates of cohabitation and non-marital childbearing represent little more than a lifestyle alternatives brought about by the freedom to pursue individual fulfillment, many analysts now believe that these individual choices can be damaging to the children who have no say in them and to the society that enables them. Finally, I want to look at this issue of marriage and the idea that it brings economic benefits. Now, sure, there is the potential of two breadwinners in a married parent family, but we also have seen studies that suggest that economic behaviors within couples differ between married and common law couples. In fact, there's been some really interesting Canadian studies done on this that found that married couples are more likely to pool their income, more likely to leverage that income, and more likely to share sort of domestic duties as well, and share that interaction between domestic duties and paid labor than common law couples. In fact, a marital status is a better predictor of pooling income among couples than the presence of children, in fact. So there's also studies that suggest that guys who are married tend to work more hours on average and tend to earn more pay than single men. And sometimes this is called the marriage premium. In fact, there was a study just released a couple of weeks ago in the U.S. that looked at this and attempted to quantify dollars per year plus hours per year that married men worked versus single men. And it even went back to looking at families of origin, so looked at men who'd grown up in married parent homes and then were in married relationships themselves and how that affected their income. And so there's a lot of data and a growing body of data on some of that as well. Now at the IMFC, we're interested in examining just how marriage serves the public good. And we know that marriage has declined in Canada. I mean, if you've seen the evidence there. But we wondered whether marriage declined equally among the wealthy, the middle class, and lower income Canadians. How has marriage fared across income lines? So I pursued this question with my co-author, Philip Cross, who's a former chief economic analyst with Statistics Canada, and we released our findings earlier this year. Our analysis shows that income in Canada, to an astonishing degree, is linked to marriage. Top income earners are very likely to be married, while low income earners are very likely to be unmarried. The marriage gap between high and low income earners has grown over time. So I'm going to go over some of the results that we found in this. The study in its entirety is found on our website, and you can find it there. I think for the sake of time, I'll go fairly quickly through the methodology. Some of you will be interested in that, most of you probably not. But just to state that the data set that we used is a Statistics Canada data set, and we used special tabulations from that data set. What we really measured in this study was what we call marriage share. That is the share of census families, including unattached individuals, where the reference person reported having a married or common law spouse. So that is, we looked at the StatsCan definition of census families. So that includes married couples, including same-sex couples after 2006, common law couples, single parents, and then we included unattached individuals for the purpose of our analysis. And we measured that among income lines. We also broke it down data in terms of age groups as well. We were interested to see what the results would be per age group, which you see there. And then we created some somewhat arbitrary income lines to measure how this is faring among different income levels. So we took the median income and we created a low income group, which is 25% below the median income. And our high income group is 25% above the median income group. And then everybody that fell either 25% sort of above or 25% below was grouped into one group as a proxy for the middle class. So some of you are probably wondering, the top range of income for the low income group is around 25,000 in 2011. And the bottom end range of income for the top high income earners was around 87,500 in 2011. So here's what we found. If you look at that top line there, that's the high income earners. And you can see that the marriage share remains fairly stable. It's fairly high and fairly stable through the duration of our time period, which is 1976 through to 2011. You can see that the marriage share has dropped among middle income earners and low income earners, and that gap obviously existed before our 1976 beginning point, but you can see that over time that gap has grown. The marriage gap exists across the age spectrum. You can't see this here, but if you were to look at our report, you would see that the marriage gap is present among every age group, that is the under 35s through to our 55-plussers. You'll also see that the decline in marriage share was most severe during the 1980s and 1990s. That's when we see the marriage rate as well through the census data take a bit of a beating. But we see the growth in marriage share at the end there. And I want to just sort of focus in a little bit at the right-hand side of that graph there for a second or two. One of the disadvantages of using the data set that we do, and it's just a limitation of it, is that for most of the data set, StatsCan counts married couples and common law couples as a similar unit. It wasn't until after 1997 that we're able to separate respondents as married or common law. So most of our analysis looks at those two groups together as one group. The disadvantage of that, of course, is because of the reasons that I've given you in terms of the difference in economic behavior and also differences in stability. But where we see this flatlining, or certainly this seem to be steadying out of the marriage share in the right-hand side of the graph there, it happens at a time when we're able to kind of pull data apart a little bit and look at marriage share and common law share. So that is formal marriage versus those that in common law. One of the interesting and surprising things that we found in this was that we found a bump up in marriage share in our 35 to 55 or 54 age group and our under 35s in our middle income earners and our low income earners. And when we pulled this apart and looked at marriage versus common law, we found that actually the majority of marriage share that increased at that time was actually due to formal marriage. The exception was the low income under 35s, for which any bump up, or most of the bump up, was attributed to the formation of common law relationships. So it is interesting to see that leveling out. It would probably, in this graph, be more noticeable if we remove the 55 plus out. Having them in there sort of brings that more into a leveling out rather than a bumping up. So that's something interesting to look as we move forward in the future census to see what's happening with marriage. Is it starting to level out? Are we starting to see a slow in the decline, or what exactly is happening overall? Now, the interesting thing, and I'm going to just show you another graph. This is just a comparison between 1976 and 2011, and it's by income group. Now, our project identifies that this gap is occurring and that this gap has grown over time, but the data doesn't tell us why this is happening. So we have to lean on other studies, we have to lean on other data to get a sense of why this might be happening. And we've done that. Now think about Rob and Rachel. There's one characteristic that they share that is more likely to be found among young married couples today. Can you think about what that characteristic might be? It's education. In particular, post-secondary education attainment. Consider that in 1981, women with post-secondary education were more likely to marry than their university-educated peers. Well, today that's flipped. The opposite is true. And not only that, there's more evidence of assortative coupling. That is, that university-educated people tend to find, meet, and marry other university-educated people. And in that, they consolidate the economic advantage and the income potential that they have from that education. So couples like Rob and Rachel are going to pass those advantages on to their future children. Now, economist Nick Schultz argues in his short book called Home Economics that stable married families are ideal for helping develop both human and social capital. The capitals, I have them here. So human capital is that internal, emotionally intangible assets that help people produce goods or help people to produce income. So things like knowledge, education, habits, willpower. Social capital is those networks of committed relationships that encourage support, information sharing, and common values and norms. And some sociologists have suggested that social capital is at least important as financial capital in promoting children's future successes. Now, one of the interesting things that Schultz notes is that human and social capital are becoming increasingly important in the knowledge economy. Yet, this is happening at a time when families appear to be more fragile and greater risk of dissolution. There was interesting research just a few years ago now, I guess, actually no, it was actually more recent than that. Sorry, I stand corrected. Recent research shows that teens from intact married families have higher odds of achieving educational success and fiscal well-being. But these results were particularly true for teens from less economically privileged homes. So in that case, the effects of growing up in a married parent-family home were still present, and especially present even when other socioeconomic factors were at play. The problem is that marriage and stability of family units tend to be a little less prominent and a little less present in economically challenged homes and certainly economically challenged neighborhoods. So there was a survey a few years ago of working class and lower middle class young Americans. And the survey respondents tended to be in romantic relationships. And it found that 72% of their sample identified at least one economic factor or prerequisite for transitioning into marriage. So that is that they listed at least one economic factor that they didn't possess but felt that they needed to possess in order to marry. So the question is, what happens to young people and young adults for whom the markers of success in economics seem to be out of reach? Well, chances are that they're still going to have families. They're still going to have kids, but it's going to happen in less stable family forms. So social scientists have identified the marriage gap. We've identified the marriage gap in Canada. There's been more work done on this in the US in particular, and I was just reading an article actually just today about some researchers identifying the marriage gap in the UK as well. But what social scientists have identified this marriage gap, but now they're concerned that this might be actually creating a parenting gap between the economically privileged and the disadvantaged. So those with greater access to economic advantage, social and human capital, and those who do not. Well, Isabel Sawhill and her, who I mentioned earlier about the article concerning Dan Quayle, her and her colleague, Ron Haskins, have written quite a bit on this, and they have determined the following. They say that if young people finish high school, get a job, and get married before having children, they have about a 2% chance of falling into poverty and nearly a 75% chance of joining the middle class by earning $50,000 or more per year. So they refer to this as the success sequence of finishing high school, finishing education, getting a job, getting married, and then having kids. So you can see that marriage is one part of that equation, one part of the success sequence. So I just want to wrap up with just thinking through some of the implications. I have two thoughts that I want to share, and then we're going to look at two programs that are currently working to create a healthy marriage culture. So obviously, you as community leaders and as faith leaders can look at this data and begin to think about some of the implications for your own community and for your own work. From my perspective as a researcher, I'm just going to draw your attention to a couple of implications, two thoughts that I have that I've been thinking about. First is that marriage is a public good. As we've shown, marriage is connected to financial and social benefits for adults and children. And helping marriages thrive in your community is an act of social responsibility. Stable families, healthy marriages are the forgotten component, especially in Canada, when addressing complex social problems like poverty. It's not a panacea, it's not the only solution, but it is one of the factors that seems to get the least amount of discussion. Now, as faith and community leaders, you need to reach out to all families regardless of their structure and regardless of their form. So it's a good opportunity to reflect on how are our communities, how are our faith groups helping all families, how are we helping all family forms, how are we helping lone parent families, which the majority of are single moms. We see through Canadian data that more and more men are becoming single parents as well, but for the most part it does remain mostly women who are single parents. How can faith communities reach out to young men who are now finding themselves less involved in societal institutions? Men are less likely to graduate, less likely to pursue post-secondary education than they once were. And it seems to be that they're less involved in the societal institutions. So what role do faith communities perhaps have in reaching them? And what about young couples who desire to marry but feel that they lack the economic opportunities they perceive that they need in order to marry? I saw a neat article a couple of years ago about a faith community that came around a young couple who didn't have very much money and how that community pitched in and put on a beautiful wedding for them. And just in preparing for this, I was thinking about weddings in particular and how much focus gets put on the actual wedding day. The average cost of a Canadian wedding without the not factoring in the honeymoon is about $23,000. I think it's about $23,500 now. We have this wedding industrial complex that is growing, and I wonder what role faith communities have in addressing that, or if there's a need to address that. I wonder what the response should be, or if there should be a response, or in what way faith communities could interact with that. I'm not sure. It's just something that's recently come to me, and perhaps maybe you have thoughts on that. The second point that I just want to draw out is that healthy marriages must be modeled and supported within a community. There are really few places where marriage is talked about and where it is modeled. And I think for marriage to thrive, it has to be talked about. What it means to be married, what marriage means, needs to be talked about. And it needs to be seen. It needs to be modeled. And I think that faith communities could be that place and can be that place and often is that place where it's talked about and modeled. Now, data from the U.S. suggests that people who are active in a faith tradition are less likely to divorce when it comes to comparing them to the general public. And one of the reasons why this might be is that often faith traditions hold marriage in high regard, and they offer a supportive community that can help couples. Of course, not everyone marries, and as I mentioned earlier, unattached individuals have doubled since the 1960s. How are faith communities adjusting to this reality? How can faith communities engage unattached individuals as partners in the community instead of just projects to be fixed or fixed up? How can faith communities and tightly knit communities become supportive places for unattached individuals? Well, I'll close with two practical examples, and then we'll take some questions in the time that's remaining. First, I just want to introduce you to an idea. It's been around for a while, but it's called the Community Marriage Initiative. Many people still want to have their weddings in places of worship, or they want to have clergy involved in their weddings. And so some clergy, particularly in the United States, in some counties, have come together and have partnered across faith lines to commit to 5 components that address marriage in their community. Those components are: 1, rigorous premarital preparation, and making sure that anybody who's married in that county through a clergy person or through a place of worship receives rigorous premarital counseling and preparation. 2nd, providing marriage enrichment retreats for those who are already married. Training and mentoring couples, so older couples mentoring younger couples, newly married couples. And aiding in the reconciliation between separated couples through mentoring. In this case, it's most often, say, an older man mentoring a younger man, or an older woman mentoring a younger woman. And finally, implementing step-family support groups and resources. We haven't really talked a lot about step-families today, but that's also an important dynamic within the changing marriage culture in Canada. What's interesting about the community marriage initiatives is that a study in the journal Family Relations found that divorce rates in counties where the clergy had worked together and adopted this community marriage initiatives reported that divorce rates had actually declined faster in those counties than neighboring counties. And in fact, they saw about a 2% decrease annually. Now, 2% doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it does show that when clergy work together in a geographical area, they can have an impact on that area. And I think it's interesting to see clergy working together to create a healthy marriage culture within a particular county. The second idea that I want to close with and just introduce you to is a really new initiative. It's only been up and running for about 2 years, and it's called Marital First Responders. A lot of people, when they, I should say first of all that this is a Doherty Relationship Institute in the U.S. It's William Doherty is a professor at the University of Minnesota, and he's exploring this project and doing this. The premise really is that couples who are struggling with relationships most often turn to family and friends before they seek professional help. So, in fact, Doherty found that about 73% of adults have been sought out as a confidant for long-term relationship issues, but only 49% of those individuals feel confident in offering help. So what the program aims to do is to equip everyday people with 7 basic counseling skills to engage struggling couples. So the idea is that that you're equipping people who are already within the social networks that people rely on. And so he's pushing forward with this, and it's expanding across North America. So much like a medical first aider does not replace a doctor's care, this isn't a replacement necessarily for professional counseling in any way, but it is an opportunity for people to provide some care at point of contact and help prevent perhaps a marriage issue or a situation from blowing into a full-blown relationship emergency. So I think it's interesting for faith leaders and community leaders to think about this, because you already know the people that are embedded in the social networks that people are already relying on, and what would it look like to train a few people to be marital first responders.